Welcome to the webinar. I'm Ashani Pereira. I lead the infrastructure work at IISD. And on the line, we have Leonardo Garrido, Senior Lead Economist at the New Climate Economy. Fantastic to have you with us, Leonardo. And Andrea Bassi, CEO Knowledge and super senior, super valuable associate at IISD. Always a pleasure, Andrea, always a pleasure to have you with us. We're going to be talking about why simulation is very important to plan a sustainable recovery, because you see, we really need to understand how our thinking today, how policies today would play out in the future. And this future is so uncertain. So we are at a time we're looking at the end of public spending on healthcare in some parts of the world, end of wage subsidies. We're still looking at extreme weather ongoing, though we're not talking about it. We're talking about geopolitics and strongmen. We have the EU Green Deal, much trumpeted and much talked about. Then today we have some finance ministers, like here in France, Bruno Le Maire, announcing that consumption is rebooting. And Leonardo, you will tell us, do we want consumption to reboot and what type of consumption? And then suddenly we have a lot of money that we didn't have before, billions as loan guarantees, concessional lending, industry bailout. The Federal Reserve is buying stocks and other central banks are buying junk bonds. Years and years of quantitative easing, very low interest rates in many parts of the world, and suddenly, globally, very low energy prices. So that's the context that we have today. And the first thing I want to ask you both is about, are governments using simulation to design and roll out low carbon policies? Can you give us examples of those? What are the results of some of this simulation, and how are those results actually being used to design sane and sensible policies that are going to make the best use of this large pot of public money that we have available? Andrea, why don't you start us off, please?
Yes, thank you, Shani. It's a very good question. I mean, in general, we can start by saying that governments have been using simulation for a long, long time, right? Whether that is simulation for low carbon development, so linking the low carbon component to the development outcome, is a different question. That has not been done for a long time. There are a few countries that have started, many are experiencing, many more are actually developing these type of tools. In most cases, this is being put forward by the international community as a need to address the global challenge that is climate change. In a few other cases, this is coming from within, from the government, from the country. One example I want to mention, and we have the slide here already, thank you, Sophia, for that, is the case of Indonesia with the preparation of the medium-term development plan, which is a low-carbon development plan, actually. And this is work that has brought together different partners, different local actors as well, under the direction of the Minister of Planning, Papenas. And so it brought together the New Climate Economy that provided leadership for the whole process and the underlying research, in collaboration with the World Resources Institute in Indonesia, in collaboration with the Global Green Growth Institute, there as well, the country office and the World Bank, with, of course, a lot of strong support from local experts and also modelers. For instance, from a couple of universities, especially the team working on system dynamics in Bandung. And so what we see here is the underlying concept they wanted to implement. They realized that the economy is driven by a variety of different factors, one of which is carrying capacity, which is very much environment related, and therefore is highly impacted by policies that we want to implement to support economic growth. And it is an asset, natural resources, natural capital, that we can use to reduce emissions for carbon sinks, for reducing the use of natural resources such as coal and so on and so forth. So this is an interesting case because their understanding was way ahead of the tools that are normally available and are normally being used, which led to the creation of a model based on past experience, but with important improvements, that is cross-sectoral and dynamic at the same time. So it does capture carrying capacity from the point of view of looking at resource scarcity, meaning we're running out of certain resources, and at the same time, the ecosystem services are declining, such as, for instance, carbon sequestration, or air pollution is actually increasing as a result of the use of energy. So in this context, low carbon development was crucial for them. And if you look at the next slide, we can see how the results of the simulation were actually used to inform the process. And the diagram that you see here was primarily used, and I think it's very telling, because it informed the internal discussion across different teams, technical teams, and the Minister of Planning in understanding the context and why it is important to look at these models. So we see a few lines here. We'll explain it very briefly. The orange one we see at the center is the expectation for GDP growth. This is the one that is designed by economic departments, saying this is the target we want to achieve. Out of this, we figure out what is the required investment and what is really needed to make it happen. But then we started looking at the fact that in reality, and we go to the line at the bottom, the gray one, we are never really able to achieve that target. And that is because we have externalities that we don't account for, and we have resource scarcity, in this case, kicking in over the medium and longer term. But then we started thinking, if we start working with a low carbon development, green economy strategy, what is the upside? How much can we gain by reducing these externalities? Say the cost of health, for instance, impacting labor productivity in large cities like Jakarta, or the impacts that peat fires have on production, even in Singapore. You know, you have these impacts that span across different provinces and countries even. So that's where the upper orange line comes from. That is a simulation that was created to estimate what would GDP growth look like if we were to exclude all externalities. So it turns out that GDP could grow by a good 1.5 or 2% more per year if we had a perfect environment, right? No water pollution, no air pollution, no resource scarcities. In the medium term, that is the amount of growth we could achieve. So now if you go to the next slide, we start seeing the impact of policies. So this is where we inform policy, where we have the green line in this case that shows what if we do energy efficiency and renewable energy as a very, very small subset of all the policies that are in this medium-term development plan. Then we see the potential upside. We see that compared to a baseline, we're able to increase GDP growth because, among many other things, the fact that we reduce air pollution, we provide the means to move towards a low carbon development. So we create an economy that is more productive. Now, I wanted to show these slides briefly because we can talk about numbers, we can talk about the model showed the GDP is higher or lower. But to me, that is not the most important aspect. The most important aspect is to understand the mechanisms underlying these simulations and the results that we're obtaining. Here we are creating models that basically represent a feedback loop mechanism between economy, energy and land use, emissions, and then air pollution and water pollution, and the economy again, through health impacts and human productivity, labor productivity impacts. So this way of, in a way, representing causality, developing a model to provide some sort of evidence, reducing the risk in a way that is expected from implementing these interventions, and creating a story that reflects reality because the models are customized to national level is what made it work in this specific case. And so these results then were used to serve as the backbone for the low carbon development initiative, the technical report that then went on to underpin the medium-term development plan. We have many other examples of this type, but this I think is really a flagship a project that supported a very important planning process.
Very interesting, Andrea. Leonardo, do you have comments on this, please?
Just a couple of them. I would like to sort of to complement Andrea's presentation that shows sort of the end product, some of the design and the end product of undertaking low carbon development in a particular country context, in this case, Indonesia, he described by means of using simulations. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. One thing that I would like to mention is that the effectiveness of creating this process with simulation policy analysis based on that takes on the one hand some degree of engagement on a number of actors, including strong leadership from a local country authority or institution that sort of embraces and supports the approach. We have that, for instance, in Indonesia. It's a great case with the leading role played by the Ministry of Planning and Economic Development, Bapenas, and specifically from the Director of Environment. It takes also strong support from the community of partners, or development partners, and the LCDI, the Low Carbon Development Initiative, has that by means of the support that is provided by the United Kingdom Climate Change Unit that aligns its thinking and its targets on support of countries with those of a particular economy. And then of another number of contributing partners that include UN-PAGE and many others. So it takes that, but also takes a lot of local participation, ownership, and knowledge. And we have that as well, with the contribution of the modeling teams that support the exercise, and that has mastered the tools and methods that are required for doing this science-based policy-informed simulation. So we had the System Dynamics Bootcamp, the Institute of Technology in Bandung. So those are the core elements for this to take place. And this is really important because what we want to do is that when simulation is made, that is owned, that is used for informing policy process. And the simulation exercise being based in something that is complex in nature, which is the relationships between climate, development, and the social economy, requires developing that sort of underlying knowledge and thinking. And simulation can help precisely to do that. So I just wanted to highlight the role of supporting agents, but also how simulation then can be leveraged in order to inform policy. Those are important, and we have that in Indonesia and in a number of countries as well, where the New Climate Economy and the World Resources Institute, together with other institutions, WRI Indonesia and many others, have doing this work. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Leonardo and Andrea. Two takeaways: that we come back to the carrying capacity, especially very important today in the post-pandemic era, and the importance of local buy-in. Observing the EE and RE impacts is particularly telling, and the taking those two main ideas, Leonardo, here's the thing. Okay, during the pandemic, we've seen that even though we stopped traveling, we all stayed at home and we all stopped eating pretty much except for pasta, literally. I'm kidding, but we went shopping only for staples, okay? We saw that the curve on greenhouse gas emissions didn't actually flatten enough. So I've been looking up some numbers, and I read that in the first week of April, daily emissions worldwide was 17% below what they were last year. And I am told by the International Energy Agency that this year in 2020, we'll see an 8% drop in emissions. And that's very encouraging because that is the largest annual drop since the Second World War. But it's not enough, right? It's not enough. Where are the sweet policy spots that you can see that will trigger systemic change?
Sure, thank you, Shani. A very relevant question. And let me try to piece it apart in two or three main elements, because there are some numbers out there that we don't know how meaningful, relevant are, especially for attaining climate targets in the world and across countries. I'm saying this because, for instance, you mentioned something about the flattening of the GHG curve, which is something that we want to get beyond that in order for us to attain the global targets. We need to make sure that we reach net zero at some point in the near future, and 2050 has been identified as that date. That means that we need to move from the actual level of emissions, which is something in the vicinity of 35 million gigatons of CO2 equivalent, to zero by 2050. We have something that is called a global carbon budget. If we read the IPCC report, the 1.5 degrees one, there is a section there, page 108, that tells us that as of January 1st, 2018, the world had a global carbon budget of 420 gigatons of CO2 remaining. That's the global carbon budget that we can afford to throw in the atmosphere forever, starting back then in 2018. In the last 3 years, we have exhausted a quarter of that budget. So the question is, how can we move from that number where we are right now, some 35 gigatons of CO2 equivalents, to zero, so that we don't exceed that global carbon budget that is associated with the 1.5 degrees. I'm saying this because it is a big challenge. You mentioned that it is expected that in 2020, the carbon emissions are going to fall by the largest percentage since the Second World War, 8%. And that is actually a number or a fraction or a percentage that need to be attained between now and 2050, so we get that to the 1.5 degrees target. So I'm going to show these slides. I'm going to try to present it in a very, very simple way. The first one presents what is called the basic math of carbon emission reduction. On the left side of the equation, you have carbon emission, GHG. On the left side, you have proximate determinants. So it is an identity. So everything that is on the left is exactly equal to what is on the right. So that carbon emissions can be decomposed in 4 elements. Number 1, in anthropogenic activity. So these are the 2 elements on the right, GDP to population and population growth. So growth in population and growth in GDP. So for carbon emissions to fall, it must happen that if we are expecting economic activity to continue growing over time and population to continue growing, it must be the case that the 2 first elements on the right of the equality are on a declining trend. These 2 elements are what is called carbon intensity, the ratio of carbon emissions to energy use. How much carbon do we pump into the atmosphere every time we produce 1 unit of energy? And the second element is what is called energy intensity. How much energy is required to produce 1 unit of GDP? So it must be the case that for the element on the left, carbon emissions, to fall, given that the 2 far right elements on the right, population and GDP are growing, carbon intensity and energy intensity must decrease. And they decrease by, as a function of elements that are identified below. Regulation, carbon pricing, a better use of the resources that we have, food and land use policies, land restoration, avoiding deforestation, and so forth. So this is one thing to keep in mind. Please, next slide. So in order to get there, next slide. This is just the first table, just showing that carbon budget. It was 420 in early 2018. It is now something about 312 tons of CO2 equivalent. So click, please. So what must happen is that in order to move from that 312 to exhaust that to the actual level of emissions, which is 35, and is there in red in this table, to zero, it must be the case that the combination of carbon intensity and energy intensity must fall by an equivalent of 11% per year. The chart below shows the amount of carbon emissions that is associated to that path of reduction in carbon emissions that is consistent with the 1.5 degrees. It is 312 gigatons of CO2, meaning that carbon intensity and energy intensity must fall by 11%. We compare that with what has happened in the 2000s, and we see that we need to make a significant leap in the efforts in those energy intensity and carbon intensity related policies so that we can move there. That includes shift towards renewable energy, food and land use policies, efficiency measures, circular economy, and a number of other policies. So what is the role? And when we talk about the sweet spots for policy, considering that we're in a world where countries have now already huge fiscal deficits, and they're associated this year to stimulus packages associated to COVID, and that the burden of the debt is high. There is an ongoing discussion nowadays about the relevance of the debt burden and the deficit, especially across developed economies. I'm not going to enter into that discussion. It's associated to something that is called modern monetary theory. But I want to say is that having that element in mind, that already countries have high debt burdens and they have already incurring and high expenditures to offset the impacts of COVID-19, the question is how to accommodate the green policies. The good news, and this is the sweet spot, is that actually it doesn't require any level of extra effort to make possible these green interventions. There are, number one, enough resources in the world being currently devoted to gray-brown investments that can be switched towards green, clean solutions, and they are economically advantageous. And here is where simulation plays a crucial role. We had the ability, by means of simulation analysis, to show how, by shifting investment and policies from those that benefit gray and brown sectors to those that benefit clean and green sector, they had the ability, by the same envelope in terms of investment, to attain higher level of economic activity, economic growth, income generation, employment generation, that are superior than a baseline that is based on those brown policies. On top of that, the fact that there's going to be more economic activity associated to green policies implies that we will invest less money per unit of value added generated. This is to say that the ratio of investment to GDP is likely to improve on the low carbon scenario, less effort of income to support investment. And the last thing is that some of the green investment, they can be supported by actions that actually generate revenues for governments to foster these sort of policies. That includes, for instance, carbon pricing mechanisms that generate the revenues such that the investments and the policy interventions can take place in the green sector. So the sweet spot in this whole picture is one where simulation can help us to identify how this switch from the gray and the brown to the clean has the ability to deliver those better economic outcomes and to attain those ambitious targets that are required so that we move into the 1.5 degrees that is so much required.
And the this is all possible. No additional investment is needed except what we're going to throw out anyway, despite escalating extreme weather. Leonardo?
Yes, actually, this is a very good point because we need to be cognizant that even the efforts to, if we were to attain the 1.5 degrees target of mitigating the carbon emission, there is going to be for sure some impacts. We are seeing impacts of climate change. So the extent to which we can have a combination of those investments aimed to mitigation and all others for adaptation is of course part of the picture. Actually, the investment in adaptation solutions is intertwined with that on mitigation. So we can think about, for instance, nature-based solutions that are so important to attain both adaptation and mitigation targets. And you at IISD are doing an excellent job in fostering this conversation and providing a number of tools and methods, including the one on the sustainable asset valuation, that are so relevant to show how this can be done in sort of contributing to attain mitigation targets while developing solutions to develop resilience to climate change and to extreme events.
Very interesting, Leonardo, very interesting. Thank you, Andrea, for picking up the questions from some of our listeners in the chat. Andrea, please add something quickly before we move on. You have comments.
Yes, just one quick comment to build on what Leonardo said. I mean, there is a lot of discussion about investment and comparing what we need now with respect to a baseline scenario or low carbon scenario. But we need to clarify what investment means, because if by investment we mean the amount of money we need to fix the problems that we have created, because of climate change, because of the loss of ecosystem services, air pollution, water pollution, and so on and so forth, then this is not really productive investments. This is about putting a patch on something we've done wrong. And if we start realizing how much of the current investment, or what we call investment now, is to fix problems that we have created, and what is the other portion that is actually to support the economy and support society, then we realize that there is a very, very strong upside, as Leonardo mentioned. And so in a way, if we invest now to reduce climate impacts, we can actually reduce total investments in the economy going forward. We will need less. If we work in a smarter way, if we learn from what COVID has taught us up to now in terms of what people need, what is essential and what is not in terms of mobility and so on and so forth, we may not need the trillions that are required in highways and with the figures that have been published over the years. So we need to rethink carefully what investment is and how we plan for it.
And so what are we learning from COVID then, Andrea? Because we began with fear, right, at the beginning of the pandemic. Now, those of us opening up are now saying, oh, we want control of our economies. In the US, where you are, Leonardo, a fear has been replaced for a total urge to control. Now, with climate, we never have that sense of fear, right? And we never have that urge to control. What are we learning?
Well, from my side, briefly, I think that COVID has touched us personally. Right, I do facilitations on modeling and group modeling exercises. I can talk about how dire the situation is for kids and babies in Africa or in other developing countries, disadvantaged context and so on, even in developed ones. But nothing touches the audience as taking a teddy bear and, taking the head off, for instance. So this has really touched us personally. And the other thing I see that we are learning collectively is that nothing comes for free. I mean, people keep asking for support in many countries. They say the government should help us, the government should do this, should give incentives for this and that. But ultimately, it's a closed loop. Whatever the government provides has to come from somewhere. And that somewhere, very often, also in the case of climate change, is future generations. If we pile up debt, someone else will have to pay for it. So I hope that this is something that we are learning in relation to how to address climate change, because it seems to be a much bigger and certainly a longer lasting challenge that will affect all of us in different ways, but will certainly affect all of us.
Leonardo?
Yes, I want to reflect on these very good questions, because at the NCE, the New Climate Economy and the World Resources Institute, when we talk about climate action, we try to avoid the fear factor. We talk about the opportunities, because we strongly believe, based on the technical work that we do, the research that we do, and that is included, for instance, in our reports, the NCE 2018 report and others from the New Climate Economy. We show how embarking into low carbon, environmental, sustainable policies does bring better economic outcomes all over the place. More inclusive, more jobs, better incomes, and so forth. So we try to focus in the past to the upside, to the bright side. One thing that, and in doing that, we were aware of the negatives of not doing anything, but we didn't highlight, because we really wanted to focus on the positive. What COVID-19 has shown us is this: what happens when we don't do something in terms of potential threats, be it pandemics, natural hazards, climate targets. When we sort of ignore the baselines, and these baselines are situations where economies can get really hurt for inaction. I think COVID-19 has shown us that it's necessary to look at also at the downside. We had a prominent scholar, Lord Nicholas Stern, who is one of our NCE members, who sort of continues telling us that we need to keep looking at the baselines, because baselines are inflated, are too optimistic. And I think COVID-19 has shown us that probably these even base case do nothing scenarios are still rosy, because they hide what can happen when economies ignore and policymakers ignore taking action in face of future threats. So I think that COVID-19 has showed us the need to look at both the opportunities that are associated to climate action, because there are those real opportunities to deliver better jobs and better incomes for everybody, but also to look at the downside, the potential threats. And I think that the message coming forward should be reflecting on both what we stand to gain when we do something, but also what we stand to lose when we fail to act.
You're both very certain that COVID has affected us. Given the reactions, however, politically around us, I wish I could agree with you, but we have 2 minutes more, and I would like to ask you both to just give us a one-liner to politicians, not particularly policymakers, to politicians on why this 11% of carbon emissions that we clearly need to achieve per annum is the pathway to a low carbon recovery. One-liner to a politician. And we start with Leonardo, because we just love your pink t-shirt.
Yes. One-liner. Because science, the best knowledge that we have accumulated through so many years, shows us both that moving into this path of decarbonization, that 11% reduction in carbon emission, is the one that can provide some level of assurance that economies have the opportunity to move into a track for delivering better and higher economic outcomes for higher fractions of populations across the world.
Splendid. Andrea?
My one line would be that it has to be done because it delivers societal value. It makes people happy, it makes people healthier, it supports us as human beings. And the follow-up question, I guess, I would receive immediately is, and what is the value of happiness? How do you put a dollar value on that? But does it really matter? Does it really matter? And it seems to be one of those strategies with very little, if any, drawbacks and side effects. If it costs more, to me, so be it. If it makes us happy, we do it. We spend money to be happy. Why not spend money in things that make everybody happy and not just some individuals happy?
We spend money to be happy. How true. So drawing from that, Leonardo and Andrea, we need to have another webinar soon, and that will be 11% emissions reduction and modern monetary theory. Okay, so I'm going to hold you both to that in the weeks coming up. I thank Sofia Balino again for being here with us. Thank you to all our listeners, especially Indira, for all her great questions. And wish you all a very good afternoon.